The fog never lifted. It clung to the cobblestones, a thick grey shroud that turned every street corner into a memory and every alley into a dead end. In this town, secrets did not vanish. They settled into the damp mortar of the walls. At the center of this stillness stood the clockmaker's shop. Inside, the air was heavy with a scent of oil and cold metal. 1,000 pendulums swung in a jagged, uncoordinated rhythm, creating a constant, metallic heartbeat that drowned out the world beyond the glass. This was where Elian lived. He moved between the workbenches with the practiced, silent efficiency of a ghost. To the townspeople, he was a fixture as predictable as the gears he polished and as unremarkable as the brass springs he coiled. He spent his hours hunched over tiny, intricate mechanisms, his fingers tracing the teeth of rusted cogs, while the fog pressed against the window panes, trying to find a way inside. He was a man defined by the ticking, a small, quiet part of a massive grinding machine. Yet, as he adjusted a stubborn mainspring, his eyes drifted toward the frosted glass. He did not watch the street. When the shop's shutters groaned into place and the heavy iron bolt slid home, the shop transformed. The rhythmic ticking remained, but the purpose behind it shifted. Elian retreated to his narrow cot, his hands moving with a sudden, sharp urgency. He reached beneath the frame and dragged out a crate, its wood scarred and worn. Inside, the world was not grey. It was a collection of rare, resilient ores and glass prisms he had polished until his fingers cracked and bled. While the town outside settled into a damp, colourless sleep, Elian laid out his pieces. He was not building a clock to mark the passing of seconds. He was engineering a vessel for the seasons. He envisioned a mechanism that would catch the sun and shatter it into a symphony of colour. Amber for the harvest, deep violet for the winter solstice, and a brilliant, hopeful green for the first day of spring. He picked up a gear, filed by hand, until it caught the dim lantern light and set it against a prism. The shop was a tomb of iron, but in his hands he held the potential for a sunrise that would never fade. The shop door creaked, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots announced the arrival of Silas. He moved through the aisles like a shadow cast by the pendulums, his eyes scanning the workbenches with a predatory, clinical precision. He stopped behind Elian, his presence a sudden, chilling weight in the room. Silas reached out, his fingers calloused and firm, and tapped a gear Elian had just set. "This is off by a fraction of a millimeter," Silas said, his voice cutting through the ticking like a blade. "Time is a circle, Elian. It is a closed loop of perfect, unyielding repetition. It does not require your flourishes or your experiments." He gestured toward the wall of ticking clocks, all synchronized to the exact same second. "It only needs to be accurate. The world relies on this consistency." Silas leaned closer, his breath smelling of cold tea and old dust. "You are here to maintain the order of things, not to reinvent the nature of the hour. Keep the gears tight, keep the rhythm steady. If you cannot master the circle, you have no place in this shop." He walked away. The shop returned to its rhythmic pulse, but Elian did not move to the standard clocks. He pulled the crate from beneath his cot, the wood scraping against the floorboards. He took a file to a piece of rare, resilient ore, the metal resisting his touch with a stubborn, grating sound. Hour after hour, he worked by the flicker of a single candle. His hands, callous from years of shop labor, were now raw. A sharp edge of the oar sliced into his thumb, a bead of dark red looming against the silver surface. He did not flinch. He wiped the blood away with a rag and kept filing, his focus narrowing until the world beyond the workbench ceased to exist. He was shaping the escapement, testing the balance of the prisms he had polished until his fingertips were numb and cracked. The metal grew warm under the friction, a stark contrast to the biting chill of the shop. He adjusted the angle of the gear, his breath shallow in the quiet room. Every stroke of the file was a calculated risk, a deliberate defiance of the circle Silas demanded. He watched the light catch the edge of the glass, waiting for the moment the refraction would turn from dull grey to the vibrant, living colour he craved. He was not just building a machine. He was carving his own path. The copper escapement lay before him, a delicate lattice of metal that had consumed months of his life. Elian held his breath, his hands steady despite the throbbing in his fingertips. He aligned the final gear, the teeth interlocking with a faint metallic click. He began to wind the tension spring, the metal coils tightening with a slow, rhythmic resistance. The shop remained silent, save for the steady, mocking tick of the standard clocks on the wall. He turned the key a fraction more. The copper began to hum, a high-pitched vibration. He felt a surge of triumph. The light was ready to break. Then the hum deepened into a grinding protest. A hairline fracture appeared on the main arm of a sharp, violent snap echoed through the room, followed by the sound of tiny shards skittering across the floorboards. He stared at the debris, his hands frozen in the empty air. The silence that followed was the hollow, ringing void of a dream suddenly undone. Elian swept the copper fragments into a pile, his movements mechanical and devoid of rhythm. He did not look at the clock on the wall. He turned instead to the glass prisms, the components he had polished until they felt like silk under his calloused thumb. He placed them into the new housing, aligning them with the precision of a master. He struck a match, holding the flame steady behind the lens, waiting for the light to bend. He shifted the angle by a fraction of a degree, then another, his eyes straining in the dim light. He expected the golden harvest hue to bloom against the wood. Instead, the beam hit the wall as a dull, lifeless grey smear. He adjusted the prism again, tilting it until his fingers cramped, but the result remained the same. The light refused to transform. It bled through the glass as a flat, muddy shadow, mocking his weeks of meticulous labor. He leaned back, his breath hitching in the cold air. He tried one more time, rotating the prism with desperate, trembling force, but the light only flickered and died. The wall remained blank, a grey testament to his miscalculation. Elian stepped out of the shop to clear his head, the damp fog clinging to his skin like a shroud. He walked toward the market, his boots clicking rhythmically against the slick cobblestones. He passed a group of merchants huddled near the fountain, their voices dropping the moment he drew near. He caught the tail end of their conversation. One man gestured toward the clockmaker's shop with a sharp, mocking laugh. "Still chasing ghosts in there," the man muttered, his eyes tracking Elian with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "A clock is for telling you when to eat, not for painting the air." Elian stopped, his hand hovering over his pocket, and tried to offer a polite nod. The merchant turned his back, a deliberate, cold dismissal that cut deeper than any mechanical failure. The group erupted in laughter again, their voices echoing against the stone walls. Elian felt the heat rise to his face, but he said nothing. He turned away, his shoulders hunched against the biting dampness. Every glance from the passers-by felt like a physical weight, a silent verdict on his sanity. He retreated toward the shop, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him with a final hollow thud. Inside, the rhythmic ticking of 1,000 clocks greeted him, but the sound no longer felt like a symphony. It felt like a countdown to his own inevitable defeat, a mechanical reminder that the town had already decided his fate. 3 years had passed, and the shop felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. Elian sat at his bench, his fingers tracing the deep, jagged grooves in the wood where he had spent 1,000 nights in fruitless labor. His skin was permanently stained with the fine, dark soot of his craft, and his eyes burned with a constant, dull ache. He reached for a small brass gear, but his hand betrayed him. Spasming mid-air, the metal clattered against the floor, rolling into the shadows. He did not chase it. He simply watched it disappear, his breath shallow and ragged. The relentless cycle of failure had stripped away his initial fervor, leaving behind a hollow, persistent fatigue that settled into his marrow. He looked at the pile of discarded copper escapements and shattered glass prisms, each piece a monument to a month of wasted effort. He leaned his forehead against the cool, unyielding surface of the workbench, closing his eyes. The ambition was now nothing more than a faint, flickering ember. The change arrived not with a storm, but with a sudden, unnatural stillness. By dawn, the town was entombed beneath 6 feet of snow, and the air had turned brittle. The familiar, rhythmic dampness of the fog was replaced by a sharp, biting cold that seemed to freeze the very sound of the world. Inside the clock shop, the temperature plummeted until the air itself felt heavy and jagged. Elian watched his breath plume in thick white clouds as he moved to secure the shutters. But the frost had already claimed the glass, etching intricate, icy patterns across the panes. The silence outside was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled the distant, muffled groans of shifting timber. He returned to his workbench, his fingers stiff and clumsy against the metal. He tried to light a small oil lamp to warm his hands, but the flame flickered weakly, struggling against the encroaching chill. He saw the frost creeping across the edge of his table, a slow, white tide advancing toward his unfinished components. He wrapped his hands around the lamp, desperate to draw heat, but the cold had already seeped into the wood, the stone, and the very marrow of his bones. He was no longer just fighting the complexity of his machine, he was fighting the winter itself. Every movement became a deliberate, painful effort, and the shop, once a sanctuary of ticking gears, now felt like an ice-bound vault, isolating him from the world entirely. Elian leaned into the workbench, his breath hitching in his chest. The mainspring lay before him, a coiled ribbon of steel that held the potential for everything he had built. He reached for the final screw, his fingers numb and stiff from the relentless sub-zero air. He placed the driver against the head of the screw and began the turn. The metal groaned. It was a faint, high-pitched protest that vibrated through the handle of the tool and into his palm. He paused, his heart hammering against his ribs, and checked the alignment. The spring was taut, pulled to the very limit of its design. He applied pressure again, inching the screw home. The shop was so quiet that the sound of the metal biting into the housing seemed amplified, a sharp, metallic rasp. He gave one final, decisive twist. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound like a gunshot tore through the silence. The mainspring did not just break, it detonated. A violent, jagged snap echoed off the walls as the steel recoiled, shattering into countless tiny fragments that skittered across the floor. Elian stood motionless, his hand still gripping the driver, the silence rushing back in to fill the space where the tension had been. The mechanism lay in ruins, a lifeless tangle of bent metal and broken hope. The tool slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the workbench before hitting the floor. Elian followed it down, his knees striking the hard, frozen wood with a dull thud. He did not move to stand. He stayed there, hunched over the scattered wreckage of his life's work. His hands hovered over the sharp, twisted remnants of the spring, but he did not touch them. The metal was jagged, glinting with a cold, mocking light in the dim shop. He felt the frost creeping up from the floorboards, numbing his legs, but he welcomed the sensation. It matched the hollow, freezing ache in his chest. Then, the silence of the room began to pulse with a familiar, heavy cadence. Silas's voice materialized in the gloom, sharp and unyielding. Time is a circle, Elian. It does not need your flourishes. It only needs to be accurate. The words pressed against his skull, heavier than the snow burying the town outside. He looked at the ruined gears, the bent copper, and the glass prisms that would never catch the sun. He let his head drop, his forehead resting against the cold, unyielding floor, and closed his eyes. The ambition that had driven him for years evaporated. The shop was a tomb of shadows. Elian did not move. He remained curled on the floorboards, his breath shallow and ragged in the freezing air. Outside, the world was a vast, suffocating blanket of white. The snow had piled high against the shutters, sealing the shop in a suffocating, absolute darkness. Then, the clouds shifted. A single, piercing sliver of moonlight broke through the gloom, slicing across the snowdrifts and finding a narrow gap in the shop's frame. It cut through the darkness like a blade, sharp and cold. The beam traveled across the floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the frigid air before it struck a jagged, twisted piece of the shattered spring. The metal caught the light. It did not just reflect it. It fractured the beam, scattering a brilliant, defiant spark onto the dark wall. Elian blinked. The sudden flash of light cut through his vision, a tiny, needle-like point of intensity against the grey expanse of the room. He shifted his weight, his eyes locking onto the spot where the light pulsed. It was not the grand, orchestrated display he had spent years chasing. It was raw, unrefined, and accidental. Yet, as the moonlight shifted, the spark danced, flickering with a life that the perfectly engineered gears had never possessed. He watched the light move, his breathing slowing, his gaze tethered to the wall. The despair that had anchored him to the floor began to fray, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. Elian rose slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. He did not reach for his calipers or his measuring charts. He reached for the jagged, broken spring that had just caught the moonlight. His fingers traced the uneven edges, feeling the sharp, raw texture of the metal. He looked at the discarded pile of gears, the ones he had once deemed failures because they lacked perfect symmetry. He picked one up. It was slightly off-center, a tiny deviation from his original rigid blueprint. He slotted it into the frame. It clicked, not with the sterile snap of a machine, but with a soft, resonant thrum. He stopped measuring. He stopped calculating. He began to listen to the rhythm of the metal itself. He took the hand-blown glass, thick and slightly clouded in the center, and set it against the light. It did not refract a perfect beam. It diffused the light into a soft, glowing halo. He was no longer building a clock to tell time. He was weaving a story of light and shadow. He worked through the night, his hands moving with a fluid, intuitive grace. He embraced the flaws, the scratches, and the irregularities, weaving them into the mechanism until the entire structure began to hum. The shop now felt alive with a new, organic purpose. And the fog had finally retreated, leaving the town square sharp and exposed under the pale spring sun. A crowd gathered, their boots crunching on the thawing gravel. They were not here for a celebration. They were here for a spectacle of failure. Elian stood beside the draped object, his hands steady, his breath calm. The structure beneath the canvas towered over him, a jagged, imposing silhouette of brass and glass that seemed entirely out of place against the weathered stone of the square. Silas stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the clock with a thin, tight-lipped expression. The townspeople whispered, their voices a low, restless hum. "A madman's toy," someone muttered, and a ripple of laughter followed. Elian ignored them. He reached for the heavy rope that held the canvas in place. He felt the coarse texture of the hemp against his palms, the slight resistance of the knot. He pulled. The canvas fell away in a cloud of dust, revealing the clock. It was a chaotic, beautiful tangle of gears and prisms. The murmurs died instantly. The sun reached its highest point, casting long, sharp shadows across the square. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, a low, rhythmic, thrumming sound rose from the base of the clock. It was not a mechanical ticking, but a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up through the soles of the townspeople's boots. The ground itself seemed to breathe. Slowly, the heavy brass rings at the center began to rotate. As they turned, the hand-blown glass prisms caught the direct sunlight. A sudden, brilliant flash of emerald light erupted from the center, cutting through the stagnant air. It hit the surrounding stone walls, turning the dull, grey cobblestones into a shimmering, vibrant mosaic. Then came the goal. It spilled out in wide, sweeping arcs, swirling through the square like a warm, liquid tide. The light did not just sit on the surfaces, it danced, casting long, shifting ribbons of color that wrapped around the onlookers. The drab, muted square vanished, replaced by a living, breathing kaleidoscope. The air felt charged, thick with a sudden, intense saturation of color. Every corner of the plaza was bathed in the glow, turning the familiar, weary town into a place of sudden, impossible brilliance. The light continued to pause, but then the sound changed. The low, heavy thrumming from the clock's base sharpened, rising in pitch until it fractured into 1,000 distinct crystalline notes. It was the sound of a forest waking up after a long winter, a cascading melody of tiny bells that seemed to ring from everywhere at once. The sound waves hit the crowd like a physical force. People who had been leaning against the stone walls straightened up, their hands dropping to their sides. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the chime, a high, clear resonance that drowned out the wind and the distant city noise. It was a sensory overload. The emerald and gold light swirled faster, catching the bell's rhythm, creating a synchronized dance of sound and color that demanded total attention. A woman in the front row reached out, her fingers twitching as if trying to catch the sound in the air. A man near the fountain dropped his heavy satchel, the thud lost beneath the melodic surge. No one spoke. No one moved to leave. The bells swelled, a rising tide of harmony that filled the square, pushing against the chest of every person present. The final chime hung in the air, a long, fading resonance that left the square breathless. Then the silence broke. A man who had stood apart for years stepped forward and gripped the hand of a woman he had not spoken to in a decade. She did not pull away. She leaned into the contact, her shoulders shaking as tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks. Nearby, two strangers collided in a clumsy, desperate embrace, their movements uncoordinated and raw. The rigid social lines of the town dissolved. People moved through the square, not as isolated observers, but as a single shifting mass, reaching out to touch one another, to confirm the reality of the moment. Elian stood by the base of the clock, his hands still stained with the work of his craft. He scanned the crowd, his gaze finally locking onto Silas. The old master stood frozen, his jaw slack, the stern, unyielding lines of his face softened by a look of profound, silent shock. Silas slowly nodded, a small, involuntary movement that acknowledged the truth of the light. The festival ended, but the square remained changed. The clock stood as a permanent fixture, its brass and crystal catching the morning sun long before the fog could settle. People stopped walking with their heads bowed. They paused in the square, looking up at the prisms, waiting for the hourly chime that had become the town's new heartbeat. Elian returned to his workbench, but the shop was no longer a place of quiet isolation. The door stayed unlatched. Neighbors brought him broken trinkets, not because they needed them fixed, but because they wanted to stand in the room where the light was born. He remained the same man, his fingers still stained with oil and metal dust, his back still bent over the gears. He did not seek wealth or fame. He simply adjusted the escapements and polished the glass, his movements steady and deliberate. Yet, the townspeople treated his work with a new, quiet reverence. They no longer spoke of him as the man chasing ghosts. They spoke of the day the grey square turned to gold. The fog still rolled in from the hills, but it no longer held the same suffocating weight. Elian had become a fixture, not of the shop, but of the town's collective memory. Elian sat at his bench, the metal tools cool against his palms. He looked at the discarded scraps of copper and glass scattered on the floor, the remnants of his early failures. They were no longer signs of defeat. They were the jagged pieces that had forced him to see the world differently. Outside, the town square was quiet. But the people were not the same. A group of children stood near the clock, their faces upturned, tracking the movement of the prisms as the sun hit them. A merchant paused his cart, his eyes fixed on the shifting colors above. They were no longer just watching the time pass. They were searching for the light. Elian understood then that his greatest work was not the machine itself, but the change he had ignited in those around him. Success was not the absence of broken things. It was the persistence to find the brilliance hidden within the shards. He picked up a small, flawed gear, polished it until it caught the afternoon sun, and set it into the frame. The light flickered, danced, and held. The town looked up, and for the first time, they saw the sky.